Hello, my name is Elin de Ruyter. I am a volunteer genealogist for Icelandic Roots. Thank you for joining me on my talk on the courage of midwives, where I'll be talking about Icelandic midwives in the 18th and 19th century. We surely owe much to the memories of our midwife ancestors who helped birth the people of our nations. These were both men and women who placed much strain in their own lives in order to aid women in labour. Theirs was not a calling for the faint of heart or weak of character. These were the days of old in Iceland, a time when men followed the seasons, not the clock, and a woman's sole role in life was to marry and bear her husband children. On average, she would give birth to about 8 to 10 children in her lifetime. These were times vastly different from our own. It was a time before electricity and telephones, before paved roads and bridges over fast-flowing rivers. This was before epidurals and C-sections, a time when it was normal for a woman to give birth at home, and her biggest comfort in this uncertain ordeal was her faith in God, her midwife, and the natural workings of her body. My own interest in Icelandic midwives began about 15 years ago when I was considering studying midwifery at university, and my father mentioned to me that we had a midwife in our family tree. This was Guðrún Þórðardóttir, the woman pictured in the slide. She was the first registered midwife for her district Súgandafjörður in the Westfjords and serviced the district for 25 years along with giving birth to 14 of her own children. I wanted to learn more about her and what her life would have been like as a midwife in late 1800s Iceland. And it was during this search that I also discovered that I had other midwives in my family tree. There was my 7 times great-grandmother Guðrún Þórðardóttir. She was one of the first 5 educated midwives in Iceland. Halvorgur Monster, she was the first educated midwife for Stokkseyri district in South Iceland. She was my 4 times great-grandmother. And then there was my 3 times great-grandfather, Einar Jónsson. He was an uneducated male midwife, but it was said that he delivered nearly 500 babies and was also called out for doctoring. So it's no wonder that I have this interest in midwives. It's got to be in the blood somehow. I have been volunteering with Icelandic Roots since late 2017, where I work on entering information about Icelandic midwives into the Icelandic Roots database. Here I've got a screenshot of an individual page on the Icelandic Roots database. If they are a midwife, this green tree symbol will appear on their page. Along with this, there will be details of their career, which district they served and how long they were a midwife for. We have a special midwives report under the People tab, as well as a special midwives media album where you can view the portraits of midwives in the database. If you have a midwife in your family tree, you can search for them here, and if they are not here, please send me an email with information about your midwife ancestor so I can update the database. This project is a work in progress. I am currently working my way through the volume Ljósmæður á Íslandi Register of Midwives book to get over 1,620 midwives into the database. Formal midwifery studies began in Iceland in 1761 when the head doctor of Iceland, Bjarni Pálsson, was directed to choose 5 Icelandic women to study midwifery. They were chosen with the help of the priests or local district councillors. Prior to and even after 1761, midwifery skills were often passed down the generations through family or previous midwives. Iceland in the late 18th century was a country governed by Denmark, and it became a requirement for midwifery to become licensed and regulated. Midwifery studies had begun 27 years earlier in Denmark in 1748. The first midwifery textbook had been given out in 1749. It is not known how long this first course lasted for these first 5 women chosen by the head doctor to study midwifery in Iceland, but teaching was likely done from the textbooks given out in 1749 and training done by the Danish midwife Margrethe Katarine Jensdottir, who was the first formally trained midwife to deliver babies in Iceland. These 5 women then went on to be examined by the head doctor and they receive their license. This table shows a little timeline of the length of study of midwifery, formal midwifery studies in Iceland, and how it changed over the years. In 1780 the course was 1 month long. By 1855 it was 3 months in Reykjavik and 2 to 4 weeks in the merchant towns. 1876, 3 months in all of Iceland. 1910 the course had increased to 6 months. 1912 the Yfirsetjuskólan Íslands was established, the School of Midwifery in Iceland. By 1924 the course had increased to 9 months, 1932 12 months, and by 1965 it was 2 years long. I've just left it there. The course today is actually undertaken, you have to take a midwifery nursing degree, a 4-year nursing degree, and then a 2-year midwifery degree on top of that to become a midwife in Iceland today. So these women are very highly skilled women. I also just wanted to point out the difference between European countries like Iceland and Denmark. They actually continued with midwifery-led care well into the 20th century, but by the middle of the 19th century, birth in North America was increasingly medicalized, with physicians delivering babies for those of middle to upper class, and both informally and formally trained midwives, which were often midwives that received licenses from overseas, midwives from Europe. They delivered babies for those who could not afford to pay, and I just wanted to explain that sort of little difference there between America and Europe. I put together a slide with some facts about Icelandic midwives. Here you can see a photo centered a group of graduate midwives in Reykjavik 1900. This is the oldest surviving photo of a group of graduate midwives. The course length at this time was 3 months long. The Icelandic word for midwife today is ljósmóðir. It means mother of light. It has been used to describe a woman who delivers babies since 1924. It was in fact voted the most beautiful word in Iceland in 2013. Words used before 1924 to describe a woman who delivered babies was yfirsetjukona or nærkona. Both have a meaning that translates as someone who would sit and watch over a woman in birth. In the late 19th century, the confinement period after a woman gave birth was 5 to 7 days, and a midwife could stay with this woman from 2 days and up to a week. So with long hours, dangerous travel and unpredicted birth complications, why would a woman in 18th or 19th century Iceland choose to become a midwife? As mentioned earlier, in the late 18th century and into the early 19th century, women were chosen for their district to learn midwifery. They wanted women who already had children and had experience with delivering babies. Midwifery up until 1898 was taught with only books and speaking from the country doctors, so it was vital for women to already have some practical experience. Practical experience was incorporated after 1898 into the midwifery course, and the students would be allocated a midwife to follow on her birth call-out duties. Coming from a working girl position, becoming a midwife was an attractive option. Midwives were the first women in Iceland to receive an education outside the usual church teachings, and they received paid wages. In 1880, a midwife could expect to earn 3 krona per birth she attended and 40 krona per year paid from the district. But not all people could pay, and so she was often paid in gratitude. Midwifery was an occupation that granted respectability and stature amongst the community. She was her own boss and entitled to housing along with a guide to and from the births she was called out to. It wasn't until 1911 that Icelandic women were allowed to study to become doctors, so becoming a midwife was the closest they could get to this profession. Tales of good midwifery spread from person to person. Some midwives were called upon by people even outside their own district because of their reputation for their skillful midwifery and healing knowledge. And lastly, midwives were granted christening authority over a child. If the child was born sickly and thought to die soon after birth, the midwife could christen the child, but after 1877 this could only be done if a male was present to witness it. This slide shows midwifery resources. As mentioned earlier, the first midwifery textbook was released in 1749. These were translated from Danish into Icelandic by the Icelandic doctors. A midwife would use this textbook throughout her training and likely continue to refer to it throughout her practice as a midwife. Her copy would be updated as new ones were released. The one pictured is from 1871 and it is remarkably detailed. These books were often read from cover to cover and often found their way into regular households where people interested in healing and delivering babies put their own skills to use if neither a midwife or doctor were easily accessible in their district. However, sometimes this self-taught knowledge came at the cost of lives. It also highlights the importance of trained midwives who kept up-to-date practices. There is a story of a woman delivering her 13th child in the late 1870s in a remote area of Iceland. She was having some difficulty with her labour. With no doctor or qualified midwife on hand, a local man, who'd had some success at delivering babies, was called out to her. The woman was delivering a child that presented itself as arm first. This was quite a complicated delivery. Having studied a midwifery textbook from the 1846 manual, this man used the method the book suggested, pushing the arm back into the womb, but he in fact had made matters much worse. The child died and had to be pulled from the mother, and she died a few days later. Had he updated his skills with the 1871 textbook, he would have read that doctors and midwives no longer used that method. He was brought to justice and banned from assisting deliveries henceforth. When a midwife graduated from her course, she received a medical bag with tools she needed for her calling, items such as blood-taking devices, hearing pipes, measuring devices, medicine vials. Hoffman's drops and salmiak spiritus were two types of medicines mentioned frequently in the 1871 midwifery textbook. Hoffman's drops were used to relieve pain or induce sleep, while salmiak spiritus was a type of cough medicine thought to cure many different sorts of illnesses. Forceps were not included in most midwifery bags, only because special permission had to be received by the doctor for a midwife to use forceps in a delivery. By 1886, midwives were required to fill out a birth log. In them was recorded the names of children born, sex, weight, and their length, parents' names, age, occupation, and previous births from the mother. These can still be found and viewed from various midwives who handed their books back in. Birthing babies was a dangerous time in a woman's life. Death was common and many women would prepare themselves mentally for not surviving the birth of their child. The midwife was a reassuring presence for a woman undertaking this momentous ordeal. A midwife would face many difficulties throughout her career as a midwife. Simply getting to a birth could be difficult, with bad weather, long distances, and then once she arrived at the place, issues such as poverty of the times, poor hygiene, lack of heating in the household, and then with complications that would present themselves during the deliveries, complications that today would require a C-section, such as placenta previa, where the placenta blocks the entrance for the child to be born, placental abruption, where the placenta rips away from the uterus, and the woman has the risk of bleeding to death. Twins was a complication that today is taken by C-section. Caesareans were not common in Iceland in the 18th and 19th century. In fact, the first caesarean was performed in 1865. The child lived, but sadly the mother died a few days later. Midwives were also presented with all sorts of complications, abnormal fetal positions, a baby born breech, bottom first, or as mentioned in the story earlier, a child born arm first. Puerperal fever was one of the dangers of childbirth in 19th century Iceland. This was a bacterial infection of the female reproductive tract. It affected women within the first 3 days after childbirth and progressed rapidly with severe abdominal pain, fever, debility. This is why hygiene was so important. Sometimes, if the circumstances at home were poor or the mother was not well after the birth, the midwife would take the newborn baby home with her for up to 3 weeks, or even longer. My own great-great-grandmother, Elín Jóhannesdóttir, was fostered by her midwife upon birth. Here we have a slide showing a parish birth record. If you are interested in learning who may have been the midwife for the birth of your ancestor, you can sometimes find them listed in the parish birth records under the christening witnesses. Here you can see the word Yfirsetukona, where the arrow is pointed, and the word underlined, meaning that it was likely this person who delivered the child. Guðrún Þórðardóttir. Guðrún was my great-great-grandmother, and she was likely the midwife for Jóna Jónsdóttir, as you can see here. I would now like to share some stories of Icelandic midwives from this era that I find inspiring. Jakobina Svann was a midwife for Árskóg, Sandur and Arnarnes districts in the Eyjafjörður region in North Iceland for a remarkable 55 years, from 1871 to 1926. Jakobina was only 20 years old when she decided to become a midwife. A woman had come to her home just recently and went into labour, and a midwife could not be reached. Jakobina in turn helped the woman. This went well, and this sparked her interest in midwifery. Shortly afterwards, she went to the doctor at Akureyri, Dr. Þórður Tómasson. She told him she wanted to learn midwifery. The doctor tried to talk her out of it, told her all the difficulties she would potentially have to face, that she should preferably already have given birth herself to take on this role. But she still wanted to go ahead with it. And she asked him at the time why it was so important that a midwife should already have had children of her own, when this was not a requirement for doctors who were often sought out with difficulties in childbirth. The doctor replied, "Yes, but this was a woman's schooling." Jakobina took a midwifery exam on the 1st of May 1871 in Akureyri with Dr. Þórður Tómasson. And in autumn 1876, Jakobina sailed to Copenhagen to further her studies. She completed them in 1877 and came home late that summer. These skills came her to good use, and she was sought to other districts for difficulties in birth, often at times when the doctor wasn't available, or even when the doctor was there and he himself had exhausted all his resources. Jakobina's biography in the book Íslenskar ljósmæður tells of a much loved and respected woman in her community. Her love, kindness and empathy for others was a deep well, and she was much sought after for not only childbirth but her good counsel on other life matters. Her life was not an easy one. Iceland during those years was not a stroll in the park, and many people suffered great poverty and hardship, Jakobina and her family being one of them. She must have married for love, for her husband Friðrik Jóhannsson, who she married in 1879, a 23-year-old carpenter, was completely blind when she married him. She was 27 years old. He'd had an accident with a knife going into his eye as a child. She stuck by him regardless of the added hardships that came with marrying a blind man. But he was said to be a very capable man. He went out to sea, farmed, and was still so able with his hands that people often questioned whether he was truly blind or not. But he certainly was. Jakobina and Friðrik managed to build themselves a small house and have 9 children together. They had 5 sons and 4 daughters, Jakobina often rushing out into the night heavily pregnant to assist other women in labour, only to come home and give birth to her own child hours later. The couple sadly lost 4 of their own baby boys, all within their first 2 months of life. This grief sat heavily with her, though she bore it silently, saying often, "There are many that suffer loss." But once when she was an old woman, she said, "It was so often thought that a poverty-stricken woman should thank God for taking her children from her. If it is a woman of better means, then everyone feels the pain of her loss. No one really knows what has gone with the loss of each child. There were 1,200 people in Jakobina's district when she took it on. With an average of 30 births a year, she was a very busy woman. She lived in the middle of the district, which was good for her travelling time, at a farm called Gamalstöðum. This can be seen on the following map. Fixed wages were 60 krona per year that she was paid for her midwifery services from the district. It was normal for the family to pay the midwife 3 krona for birth assistance, but this varied between families, and it also varied whether it was paid or not. Many people had no money to give in payment and gave instead in the form of wool, clothing or food. But she was known to say to people, "I know you shall pay when you can." And many trips she received no payment at all. Then there were people of well means that overpaid her, like a man from Hrísey who was known to say to her, "This sort of help I would pay in gold," and he paid her 10 krona in gold coin, which he paid her every time his wife gave birth. But his wife thought even that not enough, and would add food and clothing too. 1889 was one of their hardest years. Friðrik was sick. Their eldest child, who was 10 years old, had to run the household while Jakobina was tending her midwifery duties. Late that summer, Jakobina gave birth to another child, but the baby had to be taken into foster care by Friðrik's sister Helga, where she was raised to the age of 12 years. This child was Jóhanna Laufey Friðriksdóttir, the woman pictured on the right. She became a midwife in her mother's footsteps. Quite a well-known midwife in Reykjavik. She became the head midwife of Landspítali. She was a teacher at Ljósmæðraskóli Íslands. She was a women's rights advocate and chief writer for the midwifery association Ljósmæðrafelag Íslands. Jakobina said there were 2 years when she had owned no shirt. One kind lady gave her a used nightshirt, and she would wear this if she had to go somewhere overnight, but at home she wore no shirt at all. One time Jakobina was called for a delivery, and like she often had to do, she went walking. She had for a long time only the barest of necessities for her children, and she herself wore shoes that had been mended many times over, but she always went when she was called. It wasn't long before her shoes fell apart and fell completely off her feet. When she arrived at the next farm on her travels, she found the mistress of the house, who was in the kitchen serving up breakfast for her family. Jakobina asked her for a drink, and the house mistress offered her a full glass of milk and asked if she would like some food. But Jakobina said, "No, I am on my way to a delivery and I am in a rush, but if you have some shoes I would be much relieved." The woman took the shoes from her own feet, well-made shoes, thick and sturdy. "You keep these," she says. I'll make myself another pair." Jakobina kept on her journey, and many years later said that of all the gifts she ever received, this one was one of the best that came of best use to her. The following map shows Jakobina's midwifery district. I wanted to show this just to show you or highlight how big her district actually was. She would be required to attend births in Árskógasandur, which is this district up here, and Arnarnes district, which is this district down here. Her farm is right here where the red pointer stands. Many times she would come up here over to the island Hrísey, requiring crossing the fjord, and even over to the other side. You can see the area is quite mountainous. Most of the farms built on the edge of the fjords. Ásgerður Gunnlaugsdóttir was a midwife for Suðurdölum in Dalasýsla for about 30 years, from 1876 to 1906. She undertook her midwifery exam with Dr. Hjörtur Jónsson in Stiklesholm in 1881. She was only 20 years old when she took on the difficult district in Dalasýsla. Her story is mentioned in the Icelandic biographies Íslenskar ljósmæður by Sveinn Víkingur. Hers is a story of courage and determination. In the 30 years she was a midwife for her district, she had to draw hard on herself to undertake her midwifery duties. travelling to births both near and far in difficult and dangerous weather conditions. Not only that, she often had to forsake her own family and home no matter the circumstances there, often ill of health herself, sometimes even about to give birth, or she had a newborn baby at home not yet weaned off the breast. This story comes from her biography written in Íslenska ljósmæður by Sveinn Víkingur. One night she was called for a birth, late at night in winter, during a bad snowstorm. Rivers and lakes had swollen in size due to frost and slush, but she set out with her guide. He was called a fylgimaður. They set out on their horses, and as they crossed the swollen river, the horses went under the flow. Somehow she managed to stay on the horse, and it made it to the bank on the other side. She saw no sign of her guide, but it was also pitch black and raging weather. But she was cold to the bone and soaked to her waist, and she had no idea which direction to go. She had no choice but to give the horse all her trust, so she gave it its head, and soon they came upon a farm. She informed the occupants what had occurred. She thought her guide likely drowned, as she had seen no sign of him. After a change of clothes and hot coffee, the farmer of the farm offered to guide her the rest of the way to the birth that she was supposed to attend. She did make it in time. Later she found out that her guide actually had made it further down the river, so he was still alive. But this is just one example of the difficult journeys Oscar had to make in order to get to a birth. Lastly, I wanted to talk to you about Halvorgur Monster. She was an Icelandic woman who became a midwife in North America. Born at Elliða in Staðarsveit, Snæfellsnes, Iceland, she married Sigurd Ólafsson in 1874. She gave birth to 8 children, and 6 of them sadly died before she immigrated to America. In 1886, she immigrated with her husband and 2 sons. She took her midwifery exam in St. Paul, Minnesota in about 1889 and practiced as a midwife for 32 years, from 1889 to 1921 in Duluth, Minnesota. It was said that she delivered 1,100 babies in her lifetime and never lost a mother or a child. In 1900, she established a birth home. She was among the first Duluth midwives to register for her license, the first to have her maternity hospital to earn city certification. This was a 12-bed hospital that catered for poor or unmarried mothers. Many women learned midwifery under her tuition. She was one remarkable woman. In about 1900, she patented an obstetrical appliance made of ribbon designed to go around the newborn's jaw in the birth canal. This worked as a sort of forceps. Minnesota law at the time forbade the use of forceps, so this was a handy device that she created herself. An interesting story is that she was jailed briefly, but released on bail for the late registration of birth papers. These were said to be 14 days late. Her son Ólafur also became a doctor. You can read more on her on Halvorgur Monster on her Icelandic Roots file in the Icelandic Roots database. I would like to thank you for listening to my presentation on Icelandic midwives in the 18th and 19th century Iceland. Lastly, I would like to point out that I am not a qualified historian. This presentation was put together from information I have gathered about Icelandic midwives over the years. I simply have a deep passion for this topic, and much of the information I am sharing has been translated and gathered from 2 main sources, Ljósmæður á Íslandi and Íslenska ljósmæður by Sveinn Víkingur. Thank you.